Seltzer Kings.
Podcasts.
The opinions of a man who thinks a wild night out is double dunking his biscuit in his tea doesn't impress me, Gavin.
The following podcast contains...
But swearing and using dirty words is not one of my vices. I don't use foul language, and I don't like to hear anyone else use it either.
explicit language.
Hello and welcome to the podcast that asks a simple question. When you took so much acid that you honestly believed 97 minutes of unaccompanied sitar music was awesome, what the hell were you thinking? I'm your host, Dave Bledsoe, and this is episode number 522, the Are You Experienced edition of the show, where we talk about the influence of LSD on pop culture in the 60s, so stay tuned, man. The What the Hell Were You Thinking podcast is brought to you by Teddy's Tie-Dye, because it's always 1969 somewhere. When it comes to psychedelic attire, the first thing you think of is a groovy, trippy tie-dye t-shirt, and you would think of that, you're thinking of Teddy's. Since 1967, Teddy's has been twisting and dipping the wildest colors and most mind-blowing patterns imaginable. But now we've expanded beyond t-shirts. Teddy's is offering slacks, skirts, jeans, and jackets in a riot of tie-dye patterns. You will make an impression when you show up at your job interview or court date in a Teddy's tie-dye suit. Teddy's tie-dye, because one color is boring, but 20 colors, that's trippy, man.
They opened with the acoustic part. It went on for an hour, music soothing to weary hearts and hard-driven minds because it understands that state of mind only too well. Then the New Riders came on with a rolling set of country rock that sounded like Carl Perkins working honky-tonks around Jackson, Tennessee. And then it was time for the Grateful Dead, and everyone was on their feet and moving. It was past 1:30 and Jerry Garcia was still going strong. Very fine indeed. That was Rolling Stone magazine talking about the Grateful Dead show. And that's the way it will be when the Grateful Dead and the New Riders of the Purple Sage appear in concert at the Pasadena Civic Friday night, September 25th. Tickets are now on sale at the Pasadena Civic box office, all mutual agencies, Warlocks Music City stores, all Liberty agencies, and Sound Spectrum.
And you know that notion just crossed my mind.
Friday, September 25th at the Pasadena Civic, the Grateful Dead. Very fine indeed.
I was not technically a deadhead. I was dead adjacent.
Poser!
I am not a poser.
I enjoyed the music of the Dead. I attended a few shows, but I was never able to fully immerse myself in the culture, the scene, if you get my drift. This is because, as I mentioned last week, I was in the U.S. military at the time, and just going to a Dead show ran a real risk of my testing positive for various illicit substances.
Getting the contact high from here.
So I was necessarily limited to outdoor venues where the diffusion lowered the risk. Also, I kind of stood out in the crowd with my short haircut and tiny little mustache and my entire demeanor that just screamed,
Fucking narc.
no matter how wild my tie-dyed shirt steal your face was, I looked like a cop because, I was. But I wasn't there in any official capacity. Indeed, I had no authority outside the military installation I was assigned to do any kind of police work at all. But this wasn't known by the other attendees, so anytime I was out of show, I was always treated with just a tinge of suspicion. Despite this, I never felt unwelcome at the shows. One of the things I love about the Deadhead community was how no one was unwelcome. I mean, they weren't going to sell me any weed, but they weren't going to run me off either. The culmination of my fandom came, sadly enough, in August of 1995 when Dead co-founder Jerry Garcia passed away. I and about 20,000 other fans attended his memorial service in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. The day was both sad because Jerry was gone, but also a celebration of his legacy, the band, the fans, and of course the various substances that enhanced attending a Grateful Dead show.
You mean like drugs?
I very much do. A thin haze of weed smoke hovered in the air despite the brisk breeze off the bay, and throngs of blissed-out deadheads swayed and grooved with one another in a massive celebration of Jerry's life and the community. I've always had a little bit of regret that for that one day, I couldn't go back into my pre-military habits and at least get stoned, if not full-on tripping. I'm not saying that drugs were necessary to be a deadhead, but they definitely have their place. So this week we're going to talk about drugs, LSD in particular, and how they influence not just the music scene, but the whole scene of the 1960s. But first...
Oh, come on, man.
We should talk about the history of music and the many, many substances mixing in with its making. If psychedelics were instrumental in the creation of human religion, their role in the creation of music is part and parcel of that. If you've ever been around a group of folks who've been dabbling in the pharmacopoeia and then have a drum circle break out, well, you've witnessed the role of drugs in primitive music. He's also probably gotten a splitting headache from a dozen tripping, rhythmically challenged neo-hippie white dudes thumping on a bunch of goddamn bongos. From Outreach Ethnomusicology, quote, rhythmical drumming produces striking abnormal psychological states comparable to those produced by some drugs. These effects include hallucinations, fatigue, confusion, fear, disgust, anger, pleasure, distortion of time perception. As mentioned above, since ancient times, tribes used to dance the repetitive drum beat, most of the times by using hallucinogenic drugs, such as salvia divinorum, thus bringing themselves into a state of trance, unquote. But don't think it was just Ook the Wanderer and his rock bangers. Throughout history, musicians have dabbled in the substances to enhance their performance. You don't think those Gregorian monks were getting just a little bit twisted before they started all that dumbass chanting? Someone was high as fuck when they started to do that, or castrating those little boys to obtain the permanent soprano for their church choir. But specifically, I'm talking about good music. You know, the kind of music that snooty folks like to listen to instead of anything written after, say, the 17th century. From the University of Southern California's public radio station blog, quote, born in 1098, Hildegard of Bingen was a Benedictine abbess, composer, and mystic. She began experiencing visions when she was a child and entered into religious life at 15. Over the course of her lifetime, she completed a significant body of written work, including theological texts, pharmacological and medical works, and the collections of music, including Symphony of the Harmony of Celestial Revelations, unquote. Hildy, of course, attributed all of her compositions of musical works to the hand of God. But, pod friends, if you think the title Harmony of Celestial Revelations was her tripping on something, if you don't, you've clearly never tripped on acid. Many composers loved their liquor.
Rick fucking Chopin.
That guy was an enthusiastic user of opium, which he took for his consumption, but also, it made him feel fucking great. One story which I got from a blog called interlude.hk, quote, from his correspondence, we do know that Chopin suffered from extensive hallucinations. Opium will do that. According to an unconfirmed report by the French music critic Bernard Gavotte, Chopin walked away from the piano in the middle of the performance because he saw strange creatures emerging from the instrument, unquote. A guy by the name of Hector Berlioz wrote Symphonie Fantastique while tripping on opium in 1830. Sergei Lyapunov wrote an entire orchestral series called Hashish, an Oriental symphonic poem, in 1914, and these were just the drug stories that I could find easily. There were many more stories about classical composers and booze, but everyone knows that if a musician has tons of booze on hand, someone nearby has a stash of good drugs that are going to come out and really get the party started. And the reason I'm telling you this is that you need to understand that drugs and music are peanut butter and chocolate.
You got peanut butter in my chocolate.
Well, you got chocolate in my peanut butter.
So try not to be judgmental as I take you on a trip down memory lane.
Really, Dave?
Don't judge me, I'm a man of a certain age. Modern music's long history with mind-altering substance is very well documented. Cocaine alone accounts for most music between, say, 1970 and today. See episodes 488, 489, 490, and 491. In fact, see most of the podcast episodes where music and drugs are referenced at the same time.
Stupid plugs.
The early jazz age was fueled by booze and jazz cigarettes, a.k.a. wacky cabbage, a.k.a. dank mugs, but heroin was a massive problem for many Golden Age jazz musicians. Billie Holiday in particular struggled with addiction issues up until her death, but it would be going too far to say that the drugs deeply influenced the creation of the genre. The same, however, cannot be said of LSD. The growth of so-called psychedelic or acid rock has a pretty egg before the chicken origin story, and revolved around a group of West Coasters heavily influenced by the author Ken Kesey, most famous for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Kesey had been the subject of CIA MK-Ultra experiments. He claimed it without his knowledge, but dude was doing a lot of hallucinogens.
So you can take this with a grain of salt.
And they exposed him to mescaline and LSD. He, along with author Neil Cassidy and a diverse group of hangers-on, formed what they call the Merry Pranksters. The pranksters got their hands on an old school bus, painted in tie-dye colors, dubbed it the Further, and drove it across country in 1964, handing out LSD like Halloween candy as a renunciation of normal society. Author Tom Wolfe was on the trip, and he dubbed it the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, and wrote a book about the trip of the same name. The group would have parties where they tripped, listened to music, and played weird videos, and splashed things with fluorescent paint and shone black lights on it. They dubbed the parties Acid Test, punning on the prospectors testing for gold and the stunning amount of LSD they consumed. The first acid test on November 27, 1965, featured a band called the Warlocks, who jammed with their individual flavor of looping freestyle, highly improvisational music.
I'm sorry, how is this relevant?
Because about a week after this first debut, the Warlocks would change their name to the Grateful Dead. This podcaster assumes that you are at least minimally familiar with the Grateful Dead, even if you've never listened to a single note of their music. The founding members were Jerry Garcia, who played lead guitar and vocals, Bob Weir, who played rhythm guitar and vocals, Phil Lesh, bass guitar and vocals, Bill Kreutzmann, drums, and Ron Pigpen McKernan on keyboards, harmonica, and vocals. The band remained together, recording, and most importantly, touring from 1964 to 1995 when Jerry Garcia died. Though the band only had the one top 10 hit, Touch of Grey, in 1987, the band and their music was deeply influential on multiple genres of American music. And it had a passionate fan base calling themselves Deadheads, who followed the band on tour from town to town, living a post-60s hippie life, grooving to the music and indulging in a broad variety of mind-altering substances.
Oh, groovy, baby.
But there is a strong argument to be made that it wasn't so much the band that was so influential, but the band's sound guy that had the greater impact.
I don't pretend to be a technical wizard.
But you know what? He actually was a technical wizard, and his innovations in live music sound systems set a new standard for fidelity unmatched before and still in use today. But that isn't what I'm really talking about. Remember our topic for this week?
Sorry, I'd forgotten.
Well, the Dead Sound Man also made the best fucking LSD outside of Sandow's labs in Switzerland, and everyone who was anyone in 60s rock and roll agreed when it came to acid, Augustus Owsley Stanley III, a.k.a. Bear, was the guy who made the best shit out there, man. And as he was put in an article about him in a Wired magazine, quote, if Bear wasn't on the scene, there would literally have been no acid in the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, unquote. Bear was born into a wealthy and influential Kentucky family.
And definitely not Colonel Sanders.
Despite spending over a year of his teens in St. Elizabeth's Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. on a voluntary hold, which caused him to drop out of high school, he attended the University of Virginia, where he carried a 3.4 without so much attending classes. Bored with college, he dropped out and became a rocket scientist at Rocketdyne in Los Angeles. In 1956, he joined the Air Force and did 2 years as an electronics specialist, working on rocket programs at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. When he got out of the Air Force in 1958, he took up professional ballet after seeing a traveling exhibition by the Bolshoi before returning to college at UC Berkeley in 1963, before dropping out again and taking a job doing technical work for a Bay Area television station, and incidentally, getting really into the LSD scene. Being so technically minded, Bear soon realized that he did not need so much to pay anyone for LSD. He could simply make it for himself at home. So he purchased some lab equipment and started brewing acid in his bathroom and was promptly raided by the cops. Thing is, the cops thought that Bear was making meth, which was illegal, but when they found him making LSD, they had to drop the charge because LSD was not illegal at the time. More from Wired. Quote, Albert Hoffman, who first synthesized LSD in 1938 and took the first intentional acid trip in history, supposedly once said that Owsley was the only one who ever got the crystallization process right. It is incredibly difficult to make LSD. It's not like Walter White cooking meth. It's a very, very difficult chemical process, and Owsley was so obsessive that the glassware he used when he made the acid was designed especially for him. The acid he created was so powerful, clean, and pure that he became the supplier to Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, unquote. And while, yes, it was the influencers like the Merry Pranksters and Timothy Leary that kicked off the psychedelic era that began in the mid-'60s, who along with the musicians that made it cool to drop acid, but it was Bear and his lab that literally made the acid that made the acid era popular. Before Bear, the best acid available was from Sandow's. It was called Illicit, and it was the prescription strength LSD. Gray market sellers, their product was wildly unreliable, a veritable Goldilocks of the drug scene. This acid is too weak. This acid is too strong, but Bear's acid was just right. Between 1965 and 1967, when acid was scheduled, by his own account, Bear turned out some 5 million doses of LSD that he sold between $3 and $5 a dose. Acid made Bear Stanley stupid rich, and that put him in the orbit of rock stars and celebrities like Three Dog Night and, yes, even the Beatles. To diverge from Bear for just a moment, the Beatles were not introduced to acid by Owsley. Rather, it was their dentist. It was at a dinner party. A friend of theirs by the name of John Riley slipped acid in George and John's dinner after dinner coffee without their knowledge, and initially, they were pissed. I mean, understandable. You want to know when you're going on a trip. But once the shock wore off, both Beatles were thrilled with the experience. From a blog called Revolver Club, quote, Harrison said, I had such an overwhelming feeling of well-being that there was God, and I could see him in every blade of glass. It was like gaining 100 years of experience in 12 hours. John later reflected, God was like just terrifying, but it was fantastic. George's house seemed like a big submarine. It seemed to float above his wall, which was like 18 feet high, and I was driving it. I did some drawing at the time of four faces saying, we all agree with you. It was, I was pretty stoned for a month or two, unquote. Lennon would go on to buy a lifetime supply from Bear, afraid that Owsley's mounting legal troubles would put him out of business. And if you're wondering why I described Owsley as the Dead sound man and not their LSD dealer, well, that's because he was their sound man. Bear was definitely on the spectrum, as we'd say today, and he was obsessed with the Grateful Dead. Problem was the Dead sounded like shit when they played live. Not because of the musicians, but because of the public address system in the concert venues. So Bear spent the modern equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars of his acid money designing and building the band's touring sound system. He also pioneered live recording of the Dead and allowed their fans at shows to patch their own recording equipment into his system, creating the tradition of fan tape exchanges at Dead shows. Nor was the Dead the only band that he taped from. From Wikipedia, quote, in addition to his large archive of Dead performances, Stanley made numerous live recordings of other leading 1960s and 1970s artists appearing in San Francisco, including Commander Cody and his Lost Planet Airmen, New Riders of the Purple Sage, Quicksilver Messenger Service, Jefferson Airplane, Early Jefferson Starship, Old and in the Way, Janis Joplin, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Taj Mahal, Santana, Miles Davis, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Jimi Hendrix, Johnny Cash, and Blue Cheer, unquote. And if that weren't enough, he also designed the Grateful Dead's famous Steal Your Face skull logo. Originally, the equipment, it was just to label the band's equipment, but it quickly was adopted as an iconic emblem of the band in general. Needless to say, the laws changed. Bear did not, and he was arrested and convicted and sentenced for manufacturing LSD and served time after California passed its law against LSD. He did his time, continued working with the Dead for a while and the other bands into the 70s before wandering off again to do his own thing and dying in a car crash in the Australian outback in 2005. And while Owsley Stanley might have stopped making acid, the acid he did make shaped a generation of music and fundamentally changed rock and roll, not to mention the culture in general. EBSCO research says of the psychedelic era, quote, psychedelic music influenced fashion and art and other aspects of society. Artists like Wes Wilson and Victor Mosoko became noted for the design of psychedelic rock posters, which featured bright, clashing colors and exaggerated imagery. Novelists such as Tom Wolfe, Hunter S. Thompson, and William S. Burroughs wrote about their experience with psychedelic drugs, and even movies in the era such as Easy Rider and The Trip portrayed psychedelic culture that was described in the music of the time. And while the many psychedelic rock bands departed from the genre as the 70s began, in some cases, such as with Cream and the Grateful Dead, the bands returned to more basic, traditionally instrument-driven sound. Yet the progressive rock bands in the 1970s, such as Yes, as well as many heavy metal bands like Black Sabbath, used influence from the psychedelic rock genre. In the 1980s, modern rock and new wave bands exhibited influence in psychedelic rock. Trance and electronic and industrial music also used features of psychedelic rock. Some of the most popular acts of the late 20th century, including Nirvana and Pearl Jam, recorded songs with a psychedelic rock flavor. The psychedelic rock bands of the 60s remain some of the most popular musical acts of the 20th century, and their influence continues into the new millennium, unquote. The acid rock era definitely peaked at Woodstock.
To get back to the warning that I've received, you may take it with however many grains of salt you wish. that the brown acid that is circulating around us is not specifically too good. It's suggested that you do stay away from that. Of course, it's your own trip, so be my guest, but please be advised that there is a warning on that one, okay?
Although, the people who took the brown acid at Woodstock said it was fine. I mean, it wasn't bear's acid, but it was fine. And by the mid-1970s, LSD was gaining a dark reputation that unfairly put it in the same category as, say, PCP, with wild tales of bad trips being spread as anti-drug propaganda. Things like lying about people thinking they could fly and other outlandish bullshit that really put a buzzkill on tripping. As I said above, the influence of psychedelia reached far beyond just music, though I would argue music was the primary driver. Art and literature embraced the consciousness expansion of the drugs and explored it enthusiastically. Even the barest novice is familiar with the wild color palettes and bizarre imagery that dominated pop art in the late 60s and early 70s. In addition to the authors already mentioned, the Beats, Kerouac, Ginsberg, Burroughs, and Terence McKenna dropped acid and wrote about it. There were even psychedelic architects. Though I gotta be honest with you, I'm not sure I really want my house designed by someone who's seeing through walls at the time.
It's a load-bearing wall!
But fashion was probably the most heavily influenced thing outside of music. Abstract, kaleidoscopic prints, Indian paisley, hypnotic geometric shapes, and the dominant colors that were all electric, including neon greens and hot pinks, and intense purples. That's what the people were wearing. The entire affectation of the wardrobe was an eye-bleeding cacophony of color and pattern that adorned the youth of the era, even if they'd never so much as looked at a joint or dropped a tab. And yes, Virginia, there were kids at the time who did not partake of these substances. My own parents, for example, have never been, in the parlance of Jimi Hendrix, experienced at anything. But I've seen photographs of both of them wearing some wild-colored outfits that would look fucking at home on Haight-Ashbury. And it's because of the fashion that many, if not most adults at the time, imagined that every teenager in America had suddenly metamorphed overnight into raging hippies. Look, just because your kid grew his hair out, drove a VW bus, and painted like a paint shop, exploded, and listened to the Beatles' Revolver on repeat, doesn't necessarily mean they're stoned out of their gourd. The worst thing that most average teenagers were doing in America was maybe smoking a joint. Or a lot of joints. Oh, that and the fucking. And everybody was like, oh, they're fucking so much, they're just little animals. You know what? Coming from a generation who came home from a war and fucked so much they had more kids than any other generation before them in history, that's kind of rich. Oh, and Grandpa, don't give me the whole story. Oh, we waited for marriage bullshit. I'll tell you what, the VD rates during World War II tell a completely different story. So relax, Herbert. Don't be such a stiff.
I am not Herbert. He's not Herbert. We reach.
The influence of LSD on politics was profound. Wrong, but profound. I said last episode that Nixon blamed LSD for the leftward tilt of baby boomers. The greatest and silent generation parents lamented how drugs were changing their little conformist automatons into these wild children in tie-dyes, dancing to strange music and fucking like rabbits on the grass of the local commons. They had but they had it entirely backwards. The kids weren't taking drugs and boning in the park because the drugs changed their politics. They were taking the drugs because their politics had already changed, and the drugs were another different way to differentiate themselves from the Scottsville and Valley Independent squares that birthed them. I mean, if tripping made you a liberal, a lot of right-wing ghouls will be slipping daisies into ice pistol barrels right now. From The Guardian, quote, psychedelics can certainly increase openness, but this can be openness to Nazism, eco-fascism, or UFO cults, as well as peace and love. Julius Evola, an Italian philosopher and fascist, admired by both Adolf Hitler and Steve Bannon, was a staunch LSD advocate. Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, who recently made headlines for sending buses of migrants to New York, Washington, and Chicago, signed a 2021 state bill to study the medical benefits of psychedelics. And Steve Bannon supports legalized psychedelics too, unquote. By the mid-70s, the acid infusion of American culture was largely a niche. The war was over. The civil rights blowback was beginning. Women were realizing that the sexual revolution centered much more around men getting to have sex and the women having to give it up to them. and a new wave of feminism was surging. The biggest winner out of the LSD late 60s were the gay rights activists who were currently experiencing their own sexual revolution that would sadly come to a screeching halt about a decade later. The acid-tinged, crunchy riffs of acid rock were solidifying into what would become hard rock and heavy metal. The tinkling plucks of psychedelic rocks were shifting into what became prog rock and later trance. The role of LSD in creating music never disappeared. It just took a backseat to different kind of drugs. The music industry changed as the drugs changed. Someone should write a PhD dissertation on that, and for all I know, someone has. LSD was being replaced by cocaine as the drug of choice for non-musician Americans as well. Where LSD led to sitting around listening to bad sitar music while contemplating the color vermilion, cocaine led to law degrees and the Reagan Revolution.
He said it!
There were still people who clung to the styles of the acid era, faithfully following the dead when they weren't tending their organic gardens, but a large number of them began embracing stranger ideologies. Crystals, ancient aliens, and harmonic convergences. These were the antiparticles to the coke-fueled go-getters. We cannot blame LSD for the excesses of the psychedelic era any more than we can credit it for giving us fucking awesome music. Like with all drugs, it was the person taking the drugs whose actions and behaviors modeled what the drugs did for them. When Jerry Garcia took acid, he wrote Ripple. When Jimi Hendrix took acid, he wrote Experience. When Richard Ramirez took acid, he killed women and children and blamed it on the devil. Acid didn't do it. The people taking the acid did. And the same thing applies to those folks out there who took a fucking shroom or dropped a tab and all of a sudden now they're the Dalai fucking Lama. Fuck you, Bernard. You're not the Dalai Lama. The only Lama that you know anything about was Kuzco in that Disney movie your kids watched. All that shit is in your head. Nothing came from the outside. Not to say one cannot have a meaningful experience on hallucinogens. I spent a delightful afternoon on a spring day in the Sheep Meadow Central Park, blissed as hell, on mushrooms, seeing imaginary sheep grazing among the sunbathers and frisbee golfers. But I knew I was high. Those sheep were never there. And that's what people who take drugs need to remember as well. There are no sheep. You are very high. And follow the advice of Jimmy.
All right, Pina, now just listen. Everything's going to be fine. You're very high right now. You'll probably be that way for about 5 more hours. Try taking some vitamin B complex, vitamin C complex. If you have a beer, go ahead and drink it.
Okay.
Just remember, you're a living organism on this planet, and you're very safe. You've just taken a heavy drug. Now just relax, stay inside, and listen to some music, okay? Yeah. Do you have any Allman Brothers?
Yeah, I know it was just an SNL skit, but also, Jimmy Carter was fucking awesome, and he would have said that had he been there.
Life is full of choices, but the choice between getting crispy chicken nuggets or a Crunchwrap Slider isn't one you'll have to make. The new Crispy Chicken Crunchwrap Slider at Taco Bell. All white meat chicken nuggets, breaded in tortilla chips, wrapped up, sauce and all, inside a slider-sized Crunchwrap. Choose from creamy chipotle or jalapeno honey mustard. Well, there we go. Life, still full of choices. The new Crispy Chicken Crunchwrap Slider. A brand new classic. Only at Taco Bell. At participating U.S. Taco Bell locations for a limited time and while supplies last.
And that is it for the show this week. What a fun 2-part journey through LSD culture. I didn't have to take any acid to write about it. But I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't even know where to buy acid these days. Here in New York City, it's still quite illegal, and since weed is legal, you can't even ask your weed guy if he knows somebody who can get you some acid. Mention that shit at a dispensary, they will call the cops on you. No one wants to lose their license. Speaking of calling the cops, rate and review us so others can find us. Take a listen and ponder calling the cops on you for unlawful podcast suggesting. Kick us $1 at patreon.com/whatthehellpodcast. We use that money to buy mushrooms for our pizza. Love a mushroom pizza. Do all the things Jeremy tells you to do in the closing credits, otherwise he will order anchovies at the next staff pizza. So, for me, Dave, have you ever been experienced? Bledsoe, producer,
oh God, no.
Gavin, and all the fictional hippies on this show, you want to say, so, man, have you, are you experienced? Because, I am, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks.
What the Hell Were You Thinking stars Dave Bledsoe and features Gavin St. James and several fictional minions. The show is produced by Kimberly Steele and a part of the Seltzer Kings podcast network. You can find more information on the show on their website, whatthehellpodcast.com, or on Facebook as What the Hell Podcast. Thanks for listening.
I have no ending for this, so I take a small bow.
Hippies are not sexy, they're dirty!
Seltzer Kings.
Podcasts.